I'm shooting this after the video, so we've got an idea of what tools I actually used. Starting over here on the right, just a hydraulic jack to jack the side steps up, to hold them up if you're doing it by yourself, if you're friendless like me. A piece of board that fits between all three side step mounts to help hold it up. I've just wrapped it in a towel to stop it from scratching the paint, although I don't really care about that. You're going to need an Allen key to tighten up the tread step bolts. You don't really need a socket to hold them, they're a self-locking style. A drill to drill out the four clinching bolt holes to lock the mounting brackets in place. I've got an M10 by 1.5 drill tap in this, but you can just use a normal M10 to redo the threads in the flag nuts, which needed all of them retapping. The 18mm, 16mm and a 16mm ratchet spanner was really handy, not necessarily need to have. The drill bit's 10mm and a pilot hole, so 1/8 for a pilot hole. Drill the 10mm first or a little bit to mark your center, and then drill the pilot hole all the way through, and then round it up with your 10mm bolt. A ratchet with an 18mm and a 16mm. Extension bar of the Uni made it a bit easier to do some of the hard to get to bolts. An angle grinder with a flapper wheel and a cut-off disc, so you can modify your brackets if need be on the left hand side to make things fit. 2 F-clamps to pull the side rails into the chassis and make it nice and tight. The instructions, although okay, they're you know, a little bit lacking I guess in places, but they do give you enough to get you through. Hacksaw, which I use to trim my plates, but you can also use the angle grinder with a cut-off wheel to the right length to use as packers. So coming onto that, I used a 6mm packer on the left hand side and a 3mm packer on the right hand side on the middle side step mount, because there was that bigger gap where the mount wouldn't sit on the chassis, on the outside of the chassis. A bit of rubber hose to put over all three flag knot ends just to stop them from rattling around. Some Loctite, which I think is probably pretty important to put on the bolts, because they'll keep coming loose because the flag nuts keep bending through the hole in the chassis. A chisel to knock off any weld splatter, and the hammer obviously to hit the chisel with. I used also a bit of masking tape to mask out where I painted, so I didn't get paint everywhere, and also as a guideline when I was using the cut-off wheel to cut the brackets. It just makes it a bit easier than having a pencil or on a black piece of painted material. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what basic tools you need. That also comes in handy is some swear words and a lot of patience. Before I go ahead to make mention of, Uneek state on their website that these rock sliders don't suit some long-range tanks, supposedly the steel ones, and that they should be all right to fit if you've got an ARB plastic long-range tank. Now I've got a Brown Davis long-range tank, so this could be interesting, but I thought, what the hell, I'll give it a try. First things you've got to do before you offer these up to the car is to fit up the tread plates. Now they're both identical, so it doesn't matter which side goes where. The Allen key bolts, which you'll need 8 of to go on each side, and with the corresponding nuts. Now these are quite fiddly to get started. I found the easiest way is to sit the nut on top of my finger, line it up underneath to the hole, and then screw the screw down through there. The other thing is these are also slotted, so it can move forward and backwards. I'm going to push mine all the way to the back. I'll grab my 4mm Allen key and we'll torque these up. I've just roughed up the mounting brackets to show you how it sits around the chassis. Now I think they could have come up with a bit better design, as you'll have the head of the bolt sitting lower than everything else. Not a good setup for a rock slider. You're going to get hooked on the bolt heads. I'm going to put some M10 stainless steel button head bolts in there just to make it a bit smoother underneath. So the instructions call for you to drag out the M12 130mm for the middle mount and the M12 120mm for the rear mount. Now this M12 is too short. I've got it tightened right up, and you'll see that the thread doesn't actually protrude through. It only screws in by about 3 threads. So we'll have a look at that once we get there and put it on. Now these bolts have got to stay in the outside, in this outside bracket, and then be slid back a little bit on an angle, and then the side step offered up to the car. There's not enough room to slide the bolt in between the inside of the sill and the bracket, so they show you to just leave them there, let them hang there and juggle around and probably swear a lot before you get them in. So I'll disassemble all this, I'll grab the jack, get the vehicle in here, and we'll see what fun entails from here. Right, this is the setup I've chosen to use to lift the side step up underneath the car. Now my vehicle is a Mazda BT50 extra cab Povo pack, so there's not a lot of plastic and stuff to get in the way with this one. No side steps to remove. This is something you'll have to work out for yourself. First thing you want to do is sort of offer it up without the bolts in there, see what it's going to hit on. In my case, there was a wiring harness for the rear camera that had to be moved, and the other thing I also did was clean all the dirt and whatnot off the chassis, and made sure there isn't any big lumps that are going to stop the plates from sitting flush against the chassis rail. Try and get that out. Well, we'll jack this up and we'll see how it all looks, and then I'll put it down, put the bolts through, and hopefully we should be right. The car, where at the front of the step it lines up, just so when you're jacking it up, there's 3 holes in a row in the chassis, and the front bracket lines up with the front hole, and the rear are out of those 3. So as you're jacking it up, that's the easiest way to line it up, so you know you're in the right spot. As you can see in the distance down there is a wiring harness that I've just pulled out of the way for now. Just offered the side step up to the vehicle, and encountered my first problem. Was this bracket has got a notch in it, but the notch is on the wrong way to clear the exhaust hanger on the other side, but they haven't notched it to clear on a DPF model vehicle, the DPF injector dosage pump. So I cut the bracket to clear around it. I'll give it a coat of paint. This bracket is pretty well like gutless in the scheme of things, because like you can see here, it's pretty well cut down to nothing. Anyway, I might pull this off later on and weld that bit in if I deem it necessary, but for now I'll give it a coat of paint. So note to the people at Uneek, you got a notch for the DPF pump. You got 2 options. I can see either notch the bracket or unbolt the DPF and bolt it into this hole here, putting the nut through from the back if you wish, or even a nut insert in the chassis and re-drilling the rubber grommet. There's enough flex in the hose to do it. Because this bracket's got no real strength to it, I had no hassles cutting it. Now, moving on to the next problem is the fuel tank clearance. As you can see, the plastic fuel tank, it's just sitting on it. So I'm going to go and grind 5mm off that. Next problem is the brake lines are right above where that bracket goes. This is the rearmost bracket. So I'm going to have some fun relocating brake lines. It does say that you might have to move brake lines in the instructions, but where these are, it's a right royal bitch. Now that's probably due to having a long range tank, but this is going to be a challenge. Now, I had to remove this brake line clamp bracket for the rear rock slider mount. This wouldn't allow the brake lines to go up high enough. Now, I'm going to put the rock slider up there and see if I can cut and shut this to make it a bit longer to push the brake lines up and still hold it in place. As you can see, like typical plastic stuff, it's already, you know, worn out. The car is only a 2019, so, you know. Oh. I don't know if you can see that clearly, but you can see the 2 brake lines. This is the rear slider mount, and you can see it hits on the brake lines when you push it forward to where it needs to be. Now, what I'm proposing to do. Now there's also, I should also say, there's a fuel return line that I've managed to push that up and out of the way. It took a hell of a thing to do, but it's now up above that. So these two brake lines are going to sit below the crust tube to keep them in place, because I just, I surely just can't bend them up that high and keep them from rubbing on stuff. So what I've done, there's a bracket on the chassis that we had. Now I've slotted the hole out. Looks a bit like a dick and balls, but anyway. And I've cut the mounting tab off so I can sit it hard on the top of the chassis. So it should sit something like that, and the two brake lines will sit on there. And grab this, and then I'm going to have to notch this bracket so the brake lines can come around it and clear it. So let's go and do that. So we have the rear left bracket notched out to clear the brake lines. I don't think it's really weakened it that much. I mean, the leverage forces on the side step when you're doing it are more of a twisting action, so hopefully, but if I need to, there's enough room to install a gusset on the back of the plate. There's the bracket, you can see, if I move it, it's now clearing the brake lines, and the bracket's now clearing the brake lines and the return line sitting above it. In the beginning, I was talking about those two different length bolts, 120mm, 130mm, yet they supply 4 crush tubes that go over these bolts on top of the chassis that are exactly the same length. Now I couldn't understand why one bolt was shorter. That's because one crush tube needs to be 92mm long. So you need to cut about 5mm off it, but the measurement I come up with 92, and that seems to be spot on. My frustration continues with these side steps. I'm now trying to bolt them up. I've finally got the rear mount sorted. It looks good. I've cut the crush tube shorter, and I've found that the middle mount is about 1/4 of an inch or 6mm away from the chassis. Now it does say in the instructions to use a F-clamp to pull it in to the chassis, but there's no way in the world I can pull it in that far. So I've resorted to having to make a packer to go up through there to support the chassis. I'm not going to leave it with a dirty great big gap. I guess this isn't unusual when you come to fitting prefabricated rock sliders. No two vehicles are quite the same when it comes to how things are done. But this has been 8 hours at it to get one side not even anywhere near it, just with the amount of modifications I've had to do to get it to this stage. So I'm taking them off and leaving it for now, and tomorrow's another day. So with the passenger side rock slider off and on the ground again, I've finally worked out why I've got a big gap on the chassis on the middle mount. Now if I put my Bunnings Alloy Straight Edge 2000 against the rear mounting bracket, you can see the gap between this straight edge and the actual mounting bracket. Now this took a while to work out where the bend is. This bracket here, same distance from the chassis as what this is. So where was the issue? Is this square or this rectangular hollow section is actually bent. It's got a bow in the middle, right where this bracket's mounted. So it's pulled when they welded it, which has made a cock show of fitting the whole thing. But I've got a packer made up out of alloy, keep things nice and light, to put in between here, and we'll play with that. Now the other thing I've noticed, which is giving me some grief, is this here is sticking out and pushing this off the chassis. So I'm going to have to grind that flush, and as well as this one here is the same thing. Now on the right hand side step, or the driver's side if you're in Australia, this when I put my straight edge up against the two brackets, it's perfectly straight. So hopefully I'm not going to have any issues when it comes to fitting that. Now if you can tell me what the hell these brackets are for, I'd love to know. They're at both ends. They must be to do with something on a higher spec model. It makes no mention of them in the actual instructions. So yeah, I'm going to cut them off. Here's a little trick I use to get a nice straight edge. I just run some masking tape as a guide. It'll stay there while you're grinding, providing you don't get it really hot, and it just gives you a guide to cut along. I'm about ready to offer the left-hand side step up to the car yet again. Now I've gone through and cut a spacer plate which is just drying to make the distance up on this, so this sits hard on the chassis to take up for the bend that's in this rectangular hollow section. When they've welded it, it's obviously pulled. I've cut down the crush tubes on the rear mounts to 92mm on the left hand side and 91mm on the other side. Probably doesn't need to be that particular. That reason being is that the chassis necks down from the middle mount. Now here it's about 104mm wide, the chassis roughly, and they've given me a 98mm spacer, so I'm going to have to put washers between the spacer and there, otherwise we'll end up with a mounting bracket that's going to be sitting on, when I mounted this up onto the rear, it was sitting on an angle like this, and the front one was sitting, or the middle one was sitting like that. So, you know, come on guys, you give us two different length bolts for a reason, but not two different length crush tubes. So the other thing I've got to do is I've notched this rear bracket here. This originally went straight up here. Notched it here to clear the brake lines. I just physically couldn't pull the brake lines out of the way. So now, sorry, I don't do this one-handed. Now the brake lines, to give you an idea, using a rubber bit of hose, run underneath. So the brake lines come along the chassis and then come off at a 45-degree angle right where that notch is. So that's what you're dealing with. So by lowering that mounting clip bracket, I can allow it to lay underneath this bolt with the crush tube, and the notch is allowing the brake line to go off at the 45-degree angle that it's required to go off. And it sort of comes off, goes around, mounts onto a cross member, and then goes back onto the chassis after the cross member. So I'm going to split this bit of rubber hose. I'll be putting that over the brake line because it sits kind of close but not on it, just to make sure it's all good. And that will hopefully, if I stuff up and it rubs, it's just going to rub through on the hose. It's something I'll have to check a bit on down the track. Now back on the right hand side of the cab, they're both the same on either side. You'll have these two holes. This is the front mount of the rock slider. This hole is one that you use, and this hole is where you're going to shove these lollipop nuts, flag nuts, whatever you choose to call them, through to hold the rock slider. So you're going to sit that there and use that hole to guide your nut into place. Now you can see the length of that hole. If you were to put that lollipop nut that way, it's going to bend straight through. So it's got to be sitting in there vertically. It also uses this hole here and that hole there, which you'll probably have to use this one here to feed all three through. Good idea to bend these all up before you fit the side steps up, just to make it a bit easier on yourself, so you can actually see where they're coming through. Down on the rear, it picks up on this hole here, which hopefully we should be able to use this hole a bit further on down. There is a hole directly behind it in the chassis rail, so you can also use that one too. Probably best to go in from behind so you can't see them sticking out through the side. So let's go through and we'll bend them all up, and we'll get this side step fitted up on the left hand side finally, hopefully. So installing the bolts through the chassis, this is going to be somewhat of a challenge. Now you can see number 12 That's these 3 bolts here are all 40mm long bolts, so you want to grab your 40mm long M10s with the large flat washer and the spring washer. Another thing is some of these flag nuts, lollipop nuts, whatever, the threads aren't cut all the way through, and you'll have to either run the bolt through the back and lube it a little bit to cut the thread, or get a 10 by 1.5 tap and tap the thread out. I've just been trying for the last 20 minutes to get this bolt to start. I should have pre-tried the bolt in the tab nut first, and to make sure it's screwed in. So I pulled it out, definitely won't screw in, ran the tap through, and now we're all good. So just something to check when you are putting these things in. Make sure you actually have the thread going all the way through, otherwise you'll never get it to start. On the underside of the chassis now, with the front mount, you can see the slot in the front mounting bracket for the rock slider. Now, my personal preference is to slide the rock slider all the way back and have it so the bolt is, sorry about that, so the bolt sits just in the hole with the slider slid all the way back. The reason being for this is that it clears the brake lines better at the back, and when you do slide the rock slider on something, it's less likely to move because the bolts are actually bound in the hole. Obviously you're going to normally hit things going forward, so my preference is to have it slid all the way back, and really you're not going to tell how uneven the sliders are from side to side. As long as it looks right from the side when you look at it, it's not that the slide is is further back than what it is forward, which this seems to look fine set up like this from my view. So that's why I run it that way for. Now we're at the rearmost mount on the front side step mount. Now your flag nut would like to sit in there to make life a lot easier when you feed it through, but it's actually got to sit on about a 45-degree angle to get the thing to fit, because there is a gusset inside the chassis rail towards the rear of that mount. So, you know, it takes a bit of dicking around. You've got to bend it like that and bend it around. It really becomes quite difficult. I probably should have bent it this way rather than that, but the gusset seems to run for about that distance, and then there's a void over here, so the end of that tag sort of has to sit into here that way, because it butts up against, unless you want to cut the end of the flag nut off so it can sit straight. You'll have to cut about 10mm off it. That's how far out it is. Okay, we've moved on to the middle mount after getting all the front bolts just snugged up and the mounting bracket to the chassis just pulled onto the chassis. This is the middle mount area. You can see that I've got the G clamp, or F clamp I should say, pulling the slider into the chassis rail, and the jack underneath it to jack it up on to the rail so it's sitting nice and tight. Snugged all the bolts up, so it's now time to move on to the rear mount. Just a note, you probably can't see it, but the spacer plate I've put in here to take up the difference in the bend in the side step. Worked out well. I didn't need to put any washers on the crush tube at the top, so that's all good. It's made the length of that right now, so we'll move on to the rear and see what fun entails from there. I've moved on down to the rear of the left hand side rock slider. Now these have a nut, I can't quite see it, but up underneath here there's 2 holes, but only one lines up the hole in the chassis, and you want to bend it so that the nut sits, sorry, get a bit better photo, the nut sits like that, so it sits vertically because the hole's longer left front to rear rather than up to down. So this will stop the flag nut from bending as you install it. Give you an idea of what it's bent like. So this is what I've come up with when you're installing the mounts onto the chassis. The rear bracket is a bolt-on job. It bolts onto the bottom bracket. Now this has got a long-range Davis Brown fuel tank. See if I can get them in the focus. Now I've had to trim that off. You remember earlier I did that to clear the fuel tank. Sorry about the focus on that. Now you want to jack the mount up hard against the chassis rail, and then with your F-clamp, clamp it here and wind it tight, and then lock these bolts up as you go. So do this on the rear, you got to do one side and then the other side, and just to pull it all tight against the chassis. They have one final hole that you've got to drill through and add another 10mm bolt just to lock it in place so it doesn't slide. Right, we'll be doing that. I've just got to tighten up the top bolt. You can see here where the tag has come through for the flag nut. That was a bit of a challenge, but it's all in there because the bolt's quite hard to access through there. You can't really see the flag nut on the other side, but with a torch and a bit of swearing, you will get it. Now with the right hand side all done, this side took me about 4 hours to install. A lot easier than the 10 hours on the other side of cutting and clearing and bending brake lines. That was just a dead set pain. Definitely really sucked. As you can see, I've still got to drill the locking bolt holes. These are just drilled through with an M10, and then a nut locked on the top side of it. On the other side with this bracket, I had to drill and tap that because I can't get between the fuel tank and there. So, you know, that's just how that is. You can see the middle bracket, I don't know, that'll focus up all right, has a notch to clear the exhaust hanger. Sorry about if you can't see that, but believe me, it's notched around to clear the exhaust hanger. Same thing, still got to drill out this hole, but that'll finish all that off. Right hand side definitely a lot easier than the left hand side.